Karoline Leavitt got threatened by Jim Jordan. Then Leavitt humiliated him with one sentence. Jim Jordan had made a career out of cornering people. In hearings, in hallways, behind closed doors, he was known for it. And most of the time, it worked. Because in Washington, the fear of political retaliation doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be implied. Jordan had mastered that implication. And when he saw Karoline Leavitt rising through the ranks faster than most freshman members ever dared, he decided it was time to remind her of the rules. His rules. It started quietly, like most power plays in Congress do. A scheduling shuffle here, a hearing slot there. Nothing big enough to flag. Just enough to signal who was really in control. But Leavitt noticed. She noticed how her questions got cut off just a few seconds early during committee. How her proposed oversight amendments never made it to the floor. How certain co-sponsors suddenly grew distant. And then came the meeting. Not official, not recorded. No reporters. Just a hallway, a pause in the schedule, and a sentence that changed everything. Jordan leaned in. "You're making waves," he said, voice low. "Waves are fine, but tsunami politics." He paused. "They tend to drown their own." He smiled. It wasn't friendly. Leavitt didn't answer. Not then. Not there. She just nodded and walked back toward the committee room like nothing had happened. But inside, she was calculating. Because she wasn't afraid, she was documenting. That moment, that language, that smile, all of it, to understand why this mattered. You have to understand who Karoline Leavitt was before the headlines. She wasn't just another politician. She was a disruptor with a sharp tongue, a clean record, and something that terrified old guard Republicans: momentum. Her rise wasn't the kind they were used to. She wasn't groomed in the think tanks or sponsored by party elders. She was powered by supporters who were tired of deference and demanded disruption. And Jim Jordan? He was the embodiment of the system she promised to shake. Jordan had watched her climb with growing irritation. Her bold statements on congressional overreach, her viral town hall clips, her fearless questioning of defense contractors and social media executives. None of it followed the playbook. She was cutting into his lane. And worse, she was doing it better. So he did what he'd done before to others. He warned her. But this time, the threat didn't land the way it used to. Because Karoline Leavitt wasn't like the others. That same afternoon, back in her office, she called her comms director, Leah Bishop, and legislative counsel, Mark Hall. She recounted the words, the tone, the context. He didn't say the word threat, she told him. But he didn't have to. Mark's face tightened. Leah asked if she wanted to go public. Not yet, Leavitt said. Let's wait. He'll do it again. And next time, we won't be in a hallway. They filed an internal memo, not for HR, not for press, but for their own records, just in case. Meanwhile, Jordan continued his maneuvering. He didn't mention her by name in meetings, but insiders could read the subtext. The next budget meeting mysteriously left out a line item she'd pushed for rural veterans clinics in her district. A vote she'd been promised was pulled last minute without explanation. Whispers started. She's too ambitious. She's not ready. She's pushing too hard, too soon. Classic Washington. Undercut someone until they second-guess their own stride. But Leavitt didn't slow down. In fact, she did the opposite. She started showing up to every hearing where Jordan held the gavel, not just to speak, but to watch, to listen, to study every procedural move. Every time he cut off a speaker, every time he steered the conversation with a rhetorical question masked as oversight, she watched the game and waited for the moment he'd try to play on her again, because she knew it was coming. What Jordan didn't know was that Leavitt had grown up around older men who tried to control rooms with silence and posture. She'd learned long ago how to sit through a storm without flinching, and she knew how to hit back, precisely, publicly, and with language that would land harder than any threat ever could. Behind the scenes, her staff compiled a timeline of every interaction with Jordan's committee. They flagged inconsistencies, pulled transcripts, and logged every moment of procedural gatekeeping. This wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. And the pattern was clear. Jordan wasn't just opposing her views. He was trying to muzzle them. Then came the oversight hearing that would change everything. Leavitt had requested time to question a panel on federal communications policy, a domain Jordan had long considered his turf. She prepared questions about broadband expansion mismanagement, and she had data. But the night before the hearing, her name was quietly removed from the speaking order. When she inquired why, a staffer shrugged. Seating limit, chairman's discretion. That was the final move she needed, because now it was on the record. The next morning, she walked into the chamber not as a sideline freshman, but as someone who had every intention of reclaiming the mic and the moment. And when Jim Jordan called a hearing to order, he had no idea that this time, Karoline Leavitt wasn't there to wait for her turn. She was there to take it. Karoline Leavitt didn't wait to be acknowledged. She had waited long enough. As Jim Jordan opened the hearing, tapping his gavel and speaking with a clipped rhythm he always used when trying to project control, Karoline sat still, her notepad open but untouched. She wasn't reading from prepared questions. She was watching him, timing him, measuring the cadence between his smirks and his silences. And when he finally looked in her direction, just long enough to skip past her name on the speaker order, she did something none of the other freshmen on the committee would have dared. She raised her hand, not like a student, like a witness, like someone prepared to testify, if no one else would. Jordan noticed. The pause in the room was slight. 2 beats, maybe 3. But in a hearing room where seconds are measured like headlines, it was long enough for the reporters in the back to lift their eyes, long enough for the staffers to exchange looks, long enough for everyone to realize that something unspoken had just shifted. Jordan cleared his throat. The chair recognizes. Karoline cut in. Mr. Chairman, before you proceed, I respectfully request clarification on a procedural matter. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration of presence. Jordan tried to talk over her, but she didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She held the floor with precision, not volume. 3 days ago, she continued, my name was on a scheduled questioning list for this panel. Last night it was removed. Can you explain the reasoning behind that adjustment? Jordan blinked. Ms. Leavitt, this isn't the time for... With respect, she said, calmly but firmly. If committee assignments are being altered based on personal politics rather than public service, then this is exactly the time. There it was. Not a threat. A statement of fact wrapped in composure. Jordan shifted in his chair. The speaker's schedule is at the discretion of the chair. That's been the precedent for decades. Precedent, she repeated, doesn't make something justifiable. It just makes it familiar. The room fell still. There was no shouting. No table pounding, just a young congresswoman speaking plainly, and a senior chairman scrambling to maintain authority without showing his hand. He tried again. We have a full docket today. You'll have an opportunity to submit your remarks in writing. Karoline's reply was surgical. I didn't run for office to whisper behind closed doors. I ran to speak, on the record, in the light and without fear. It was subtle, controlled, but unmistakably direct. And for the first time in the hearing, Jordan had no immediate comeback. Across the table, Representative Bowen, a moderate Democrat known for his careful neutrality, glanced up. He'd seen Jordan dominate dozens of hearings. But this wasn't domination. This was resistance. Clean, effective, and dangerously resonant. Leah Bishop, Karoline's communications director, sat in the audience gallery, already tapping notes into her phone. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew it had started. Jordan, perhaps sensing how close he was to losing control of the room, tried to pivot. If the Congresswoman would like to yield the floor, we can return to the scheduled witnesses. Karoline didn't flinch. I didn't yield when you cornered me in the hallway, Mr. Jordan. I won't yield now. There it was, the sentence, the one that didn't need emphasis, that didn't need explanation. It floated in the air like a blade just unsheathed. Quiet, reflective, razor-sharp. The gasp wasn't audible, but the silence that followed was louder than any reaction. She had said it. On the record, not an accusation, not an outburst, just a statement rooted in memory and courage. Jordan's face didn't redden immediately. That came after. First came the stillness, like a man who realizes too late that the cameras were rolling before he'd chosen his expression. Reporters in the back began typing faster. Phones rose slowly. A low hum of reaction rippled through the press row. This was the kind of moment they came for. The kind that couldn't be planned or spun. The kind that happened, and then rewrote the political weather. The rest of the committee didn't know what to say. Some leaned back. Others stared down at their papers. A few exchanged unreadable glances. But no one defended Jordan. No one interrupted. Because the truth, unlike protocol, has a rhythm that silences everything around it. Jordan's next move was critical, and he knew it. He reached for the gavel, but stopped just before tapping. "Congresswoman," he said, voice controlled, "this committee expects professionalism from all members." Karoline gave a slight nod. "Then may I proceed with my original line of questioning?" He hesitated. It was already too late. If he said no, it would confirm her statement. If he said yes, he would look like he was conceding. She had placed him in the very trap he thought he'd set for her, and she'd done it without shouting, without threats, without even raising her voice. Jordan nodded, barely. "You have 2 minutes." "Thank you," she said, flipping her folder open at last. "I'll only need one." The witness, a telecom executive with a long resume and an even longer history of federal funding, looked visibly nervous, not because of her questions, but because of the energy in the room. The tide had turned, and everyone felt it. She asked 3 questions. Simple, factual, sharp. No grandstanding. No theatrics. Just enough to remind everyone why she was elected. And then she closed her folder. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she said. "I yield." This time, the room did gasp, because that yield wasn't submission. It was victory. A reminder that yielding, when done at the right moment, isn't weakness. It's strategy. Jordan moved to the next speaker quickly. Too quickly. As if by skipping forward, he could skip what had just happened. He couldn't. Within minutes, clips of the exchange began circulating. First on C-SPAN's live feed, then on Twitter, then everywhere. And the phrase? It wasn't "I yield." It was, "I didn't yield when you cornered me in the hallway, Mr. Jordan. I won't yield now." 8 words, 1 sentence. And just like that, the power dynamic shifted, not just in that room, but across every screen that replayed it. Karoline Leavitt hadn't raised her voice, but somehow it had echoed louder than any shout. It didn't take long. By the time the hearing adjourned, the sentence had already reached a dozen political reporters' inboxes. Within the hour, it was being clipped and posted on political Twitter accounts, captioned in bold, white font over congressional hearing footage. By sunset, the quote had entered headlines. "I didn't yield when you cornered me in the hallway, Mr. Jordan. I won't yield now." And by nightfall, it was being read aloud on cable news, each anchor pausing after the word cornered, each panel of commentators trying to dissect what had just happened without sounding like they'd missed a point. But they had, because what Karoline Leavitt had done wasn't just challenge Jim Jordan. It was dismantle him, quietly, without slander, without theatrics, without even looking like she had planned to. That was the danger of it. That was why it spread so fast. This wasn't a manufactured moment. It was real. The kind of real Washington doesn't know how to process. At first, Jordan's office tried to ignore it. They issued no statement. The internal guidance to staffers was, it was a misunderstanding. Don't feed the drama. But by the next morning, the drama was on the front page of Politico. Leavitt silences Jordan with 1 sentence. What did he say in the hallway? The next headline came from Axios. When power blinked, a moment that could reshape House dynamics. Then CNN aired a short segment with side-by-side footage. Jordan speaking over Leavitt in the hearing, followed by her sentence, followed by the stunned stillness in the room. That's when the speculation started. What had he said in the hallway? Was this part of a pattern? Had other young members been pressured? Were leadership figures enabling intimidation tactics? And suddenly, Jim Jordan wasn't chairman. He was a question mark. Inside Jordan's office, The staffers were scrambling. His chief of staff, a man who had spent years helping Jordan craft his image as a relentless fighter, advised staying the course. Ride it out. Don't respond directly. It'll pass. But it didn't, because the clip kept growing, and the silence kept growing with it. What made it worse was how Leavitt handled it. She didn't tweet. She didn't brag. She didn't even mention it publicly. When a reporter caught her outside her office and asked what Jordan had said in the hallway, she just smiled slightly. Congressional hallways are places where power likes to whisper. I prefer to speak on the record. And she walked away. That restraint, that grace, that's what made it lethal. It wasn't just what she said in the hearing. It was what she didn't say afterward. She refused to play the game Jordan had mastered. And so the public filled in the blanks. The silence around the moment gave it more weight than any accusation ever could. Meanwhile, Jordan's allies were getting nervous. A few quietly reached out to his office, asking what had happened, really. Others stayed silent, watching, calculating. Because in Washington, you never back the wrong horse too early. A senior aide from the speaker's office allegedly sent a private message. Control this before it gets out of hand. But it already had. Because Leavitt's sentence wasn't just being analyzed by news anchors. It was being dissected by voters. Grassroots conservatives, young women in politics, first-time candidates, congressional interns, law students, journalists, anyone who had ever been interrupted, dismissed, or silenced in a room full of men with louder titles. They weren't reading the sentence as a punch. They were reading it as a flag, a line in the sand, a refusal to back down politely. And for Jim Jordan, it was a beginning of exposure. 3 days after the hearing, an anonymous staffer from another congressional office gave an interview to a mid-sized political outlet. Jordan's known for hallway pressure. It's how he gets people to fall in line, without having to put it on the record. The next day, a former committee member tweeted, without tagging anyone, "Some people build their reputations on fear, but fear wears off, especially when someone finally speaks." The floodgates cracked. More quiet stories began surfacing. Emails, meeting notes, whisper campaigns. One staffer posted a screenshot of a scheduling email that appeared to show Jordan's office blocking Leavitt from a joint press appearance she had already been approved for. No commentary, just the email. Within hours, #Yield the Floor was trending, and Jordan, he was losing ground faster than he could speak. His usual media defenders, those who built brands on political confrontation, were hesitant. They didn't know how to spin this. There was no shouting match to frame, no partisan outrage to lean on, just one sentence. And one man who couldn't explain why it had landed so hard. Fox News remained quiet. The Daily Caller ran a vague headline, "What happened in the hallway?" But the public wasn't waiting for proof. They were responding to something else. Tone, demeanor, character. And Karoline Leavitt had said more with one sentence than most politicians said in a 10-minute monologue. Jordan's team attempted damage control, leaked statement to reporters, suggesting Leavitt was misinterpreting a casual comment. One anonymous aide claimed the hallway exchange wasn't even memorable. But that was a mistake. Because if it wasn't memorable, why was it being denied so forcefully? The circular logic began unraveling. By the end of the week, 6 House members had issued statements, none accusing Jordan, but all calling for a review of interchamber dynamics and the treatment of junior members. Soft language, but pointed nonetheless. Karoline Leavitt still said nothing. She continued showing up, sitting in her seat, taking notes, asking questions, letting the room shift around her. She didn't need to say the sentence again. She'd said it once, and once was enough. Behind the scenes, though, her office was carefully tracking every moment. Every time her name was left off a speaker's list. Every time an internal memo didn't reach her inbox. Every time an older colleague looked away when they used to shake her hand. Because the battle was no longer about one hallway, one quote, or one man. It was about how silence echoes when it's finally broken. And Jim Jordan? He wasn't used to echoes. He was used to applause. But now, the applause wasn't coming. Not from the members. not from the press, and not from the people who had once praised his discipline and control. Now, they were watching him closely and asking quietly, why did that one sentence shake you this much? Karoline Leavitt didn't hold a press conference. She didn't call for Jim Jordan's resignation. She didn't tweet a thread. Instead, she filed paperwork. The following Monday, without fanfare, she introduced a short but pointed piece of legislation. It was titled the Legislative Integrity and Access Act. The bill required all committee speaker orders, internal schedule changes, and procedural removals to be documented in a transparent archive available to all House members and their staff. No more quiet edits. No more invisible punishments. No more hallway punishments disguised as logistics. Reporters barely noticed at first, but House staffers did, because if passed, it would eliminate one of the most potent tools used by powerful committee chairs, the ability to sideline dissent quietly without accountability. She attached no public statement. The submission came through regular order, but her colleagues understood exactly what it meant, and so did Jordan, because this wasn't about revenge. This was about structure, about reform, about making sure no young member ever had to wait for their voice to be allowed. Representative Ortiz, a moderate Republican from Arizona, co-sponsored the bill within 24 hours. Then came a Democrat from Illinois, then another Republican. The word was spreading, quietly, just like the sentence had. By the end of the week, the bill had 11 co-sponsors. None of them mentioned Jim Jordan by name. They didn't have to. The Speaker's office took notice. Whips began asking whether Leavitt was planning more. She wasn't yet, but she didn't deny the possibility either. Leah Bishop, her communications director, took a call from a political reporter. Are you turning this into a broader movement? Leah answered carefully. Karoline's not here to create drama. She's here to create records. And now that the record is loud, she's making sure the rules catch up. Meanwhile, Jordan's office remained defensive. Rumors swirled of internal friction. His communications aide had reportedly advised addressing the sentence head-on in a Fox News appearance. Jordan refused. He didn't want to validate the moment. But the problem was, the moment no longer needed his validation. It was growing on its own, because Karoline Leavitt wasn't speaking about it anymore. She was legislating, and in a city obsessed with noise, that silence was deafening. Jim Jordan didn't crack in public. Not yet, but inside his circles, the shift had begun. A senior member of his own party, someone who'd once praised Jordan control committee proceedings, quietly asked to be reassigned from an upcoming joint appearance. Optics, he said. That was all. Stafford began taking longer to respond to Jordan's internal memos. His name didn't carry the same urgency it once did. Even cable news bookers, once eager to host him on primetime panels, started passing, offering vague excuses about scheduling conflicts. And the worst part? Karoline Leavitt still hadn't spoken his name again. Not once. Her restraint was becoming its own narrative. Columnists describe her as deliberate, measured, disciplined. Words that once belonged to Jordan were being transferred, quietly, decisively, to her. In the cafeteria, a freshman congressman leaned over and whispered to his colleague. It's not what she said. It's how she never needed to say it again. The silence was still growing, but now it was circling Jordan. And for the first time in years, the man who ruled through intimidation was the one being watched. The next hearing was supposed to be routine. Jordan entered with the same gavel, the same notes, the same posture control. But something was different. Karoline Leavitt sat near the end of the row, calm, still unbothered. When her name came up, Jordan barely hesitated. The chair recognized a gentlewoman from New Hampshire. Clear, concise, focused, not a single word about the hallway, not a glance at the chairman. Just questions, on the record, sharp as ever. And when she finished, there was a pause, not out of shock, but out of respect. No one interrupted. No one tried to move on too quickly. For the first time, Jim Jordan looked like he was following the room, not leading it. And Karoline Leavitt? She didn't look like she had won. She looked like she'd been here all along, just waiting for the noise to quiet enough of the truth to be heard. Jim Jordan didn't like what the silence had become. He had always operated best in noise, in rapid-fire exchanges, raised voices, sound bites. But this silence, it wasn't quiet. It was condemning. So he did what politicians do when they feel the ground shifting. He tried to rewrite the moment. 1 week after Karoline Leavitt calmly re-entered the committee spotlight, Jordan made a calculated move. He went on a friendly media program, not prime time, but safe, and the host lobbed him a question he'd clearly asked to be asked. "Congressman, there's been a lot of chatter about what happened in that hearing room with Representative Leavitt. Do you think this is just political theater?" Jordan smirked. Not his usual sharp grin, but something smaller, more practiced. "Look, I've served in Congress long enough to know when things get taken out of context. A hallway comment becomes a headline. That's politics today." He leaned into the camera. "She's new and passionate, and I respect that. But let's be clear, there was no threat. There was no disrespect. There was a scheduling adjustment, and it became a social media moment." The interviewer nodded politely, but even the way the segment ended, quickly, without follow-ups, it was obvious. The message hadn't landed, because the audience had already seen the moment, and more importantly, they had felt it. Jordan's attempt to frame it as nothing only reminded people how hard he was working to make it disappear. The response online was swift. Clips of the original exchange were reposted. Edited versions highlighted the exact sentence. Commentators pulled the quote again and matched it with Jordan's denial. There was no threat. "I didn't yield when you cornered me in the hallway." The contradiction didn't need to be argued. It was self-evident. And Karoline Leavitt? She said nothing. No quote, no post, no comment to the press. When asked by a reporter outside the chamber if she'd seen the interview, she simply said, "I saw the hearing, and so did everyone else." That was all, and somehow it was more effective than a 1,000-word rebuttal. Inside the Capitol, Jordan tried again to assert normalcy. He moved ahead on new committee initiatives. He called strategy meetings. He tried to cut jokes in the hallway the way he used to, but something was missing. People still took his calls, but they didn't echo him as quickly. Colleagues still nodded when he walked by, but they didn't linger like they once had. And when he spoke in hearings, staffers noticed a subtle shift. The room no longer leaned forward. It sat back, because whether he admitted it or not, the chair wasn't as alone anymore. Leavitt hadn't taken it with a vote. She had taken it with a sentence, and with silence, and with proof that power doesn't always need to roar. It just needs to stay standing long enough for the noise to pass. A week later, during a floor session, Jordan made one last move. He approached Leavitt quietly before votes were called. No cameras, no reporters, just two members, face to face. A staffer watching from the far end of the chamber described it later. He looked like he was trying to say something, maybe fix it, maybe reframe it. She let him talk. She just nodded a few times. Then she turned away and walked back to her seat. No handshake, no words in return. Another reporter asked her what he said. Leavitt didn't share. She never has. And that's what makes a story linger. Not just a confrontation, but the refusal to give it any more air than it deserved. The final blow wasn't what she said. It was what she withheld. The restraint, the dignity, the discipline. She never made it about him. And that's what made it undeniable. Because Jordan may have tried to rewrite the moment, but Karoline Leavitt never had to. Weeks passed. Headlines moved on. New hearings filled the schedule. But something about that moment between Karoline Leavitt and Jim Jordan didn't disappear. Because it hadn't been a scandal. It hadn't been a press war. It hadn't even been a fight. It was something quieter. Something deeper. A shift. Karoline Leavitt continued her work. Floor speeches. Policy research. Oversight questions. Her voice in hearings wasn't louder. It was steadier. Every time she spoke, more people listened. Not because she was dramatic, but because she wasn't. When her bill, the Legislative Integrity and Access Act, passed its first committee review, it didn't make front-page news. But inside the chamber it was noticed. Several members who had once overlooked her quietly co-sponsored it. Others followed suit. One congresswoman told a reporter off the record, "She's not trying to burn the place down. She's just refusing to be erased." And Jim Jordan? He never regained the same presence. Not because he was punished, but because he had been seen. Fully. And once seen, power rooted in fear rarely survives the light. Karoline never repeated the sentence. She didn't need to. Everyone else already had. It echoed through hearings, through staff briefings, through committee rooms. And every young member, watching from behind a stack of legislation, remembered it. I didn't yield when you cornered me in the hallway. I won't yield now. If that moment spoke to you, if you believe silence can be more powerful than shouting, and that courage doesn't always look like a speech, comment the word STAND. Subscribe to this channel if you believe accountability isn't a political party. It's a posture, one that never yields, not to pressure, not to fear, and not to silence.